Welcome to the Italian Renaissance podcast, where we discuss the culture and art of 15th and 16th century Italy. I'm your host, Lawrence Gianangeli. Andiamo avanti. Renaissance people, welcome back to the Italian Renaissance podcast, and I am so excited to bring on Michael Curtotti again to the show, who has done an amazing work on the second book in his series on Shakespeare. We had Michael on previously to discuss his work on Matteo Bandello's novella that inspired William Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. And now, in continuation of our discussion of the court of Este, Ferrara, he has done amazing work on the author Cinzio, who wrote a novella called Desdemona, which would ultimately inspire Shakespeare's Othello. Michael Curtotti, thank you so much for joining us again today.
Thank you, Lawrence. It's wonderful to have the opportunity to speak with you again. It was wonderful speaking with you about Romeo and Juliet, and I'm really looking forward to discussing Cinthio's Othello, or his Desdemona. And I want to congratulate you on your work on the Italian Renaissance podcast. It's a fantastic journey through the art, culture, and history of the Renaissance. And I want to congratulate you particularly for your, extending your podcast to Ferrara and the other courts, which have played such an important part in the Renaissance. So thank you. It's wonderful to be speaking with you again.
Thank you. And I'm extremely excited that we get to do this, especially because the work that you're doing here on Cintho, I'm saying Cinzio, I'm saying the Italian here, on Cintho is well beyond my own scope. I do not do a lot of work in the mid 16th century. So I'm excited to have you here to help us work through this, because we did in the last two episodes. This is going to be our conclusion to Ferrara, by the way. We went through the courts of Niccolo III, which is in the early 15th century, all the way to Alfonso I. And Alfonso I, Duke of Ferrara, is the father of Cinzio's patron, his successor, Ercole II. We've discussed Ercole I in a bit of detail, but now we're on to Alfonso's son with Lucrezia Borgia. So Alfonso I and Lucrezia Borgia, their son Ercole II, the fourth Duke of Ferrara, and he becomes Duke in 1534. So Michael, thinking primarily about the literary and the theater culture in Ferrara, can you walk us through some of the background of Ercole II's cultural moment and his patronage?
Sure. Thanks, Lawrence. So at the beginning of Ercole II's reign, Ferrara was still flying high. For example, in 1528, Ercole II married Renée of France, the daughter of King Louis II of France, which gives you an idea of the standing of Ferrara at this point. And Ercole's reign really continued the commercial success of Ferrara, its commercial and political success through careful diplomatic manoeuvring and a policy of neutrality, even though the world around Ferrara was changing. And I think that's an important context to bring into our conversation. So we're getting towards the end of the period of the high Italian Renaissance, as we might phrase it, well into the Italian wars, and those wars really brought an end to that cultural flowering as Italy became increasingly colonized by France and Spain. So that was an important shift. Another shift was that we're entering the era of the wars of religion, the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation. It was becoming a more intolerant and sectarian age and a more serious age. And we can see an example of that, an important example of that in Ercole's own life. His wife, Renée, was Protestant in her leanings, and she cultivated a Protestant circle around herself, even hosting John Calvin for a while. And eventually, Ercole himself accused Renée of heresy, and she was put on trial, and she recanted under pressure from her husband and the Inquisition. So you can see, that's an important change. The kind of, I guess, more freewheeling Renaissance was disappearing, and the kind of things that you could maybe get away with earlier, you might not be able to get away with in the time that we're looking at. And, as you've explored in your first two episodes, Ferrara already has a long tradition by this stage of patronage in the arts. And this didn't stop, but it did adapt to these new times and conditions. Visual arts, I believe, took a little bit of a retreat in this era, but also in this era, Ferrara became Italy's leading centre of music, attracting many leading musicians, and it was also continuing to make an influential contribution in literature and theatre, and particularly through the work of Cintho or Giovanni Battista Giraldi, who we'll be particularly talking about today.
And that's a perfect summary and segue into the next question that I have for you here. And that is Giovanni Battista Giraldi Cinzio, as we like, is who you've translated in your latest book, which came out earlier this year. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah.
And of course, we'll have that linked in the show notes. But he was a courtier in Ercole II's Ferrara. So before we get into the work that you translated itself, can you tell us about Cinzio and how he functioned historically within Ercole II's court?
Sure. He's a really interesting character, Cintho or Cinzio. He's best known in the English-speaking world today because of his novellas, particularly in the example of his novella that inspired Othello. However, his contribution is far more wide-ranging than that. He was born in 1504 to a wealthy family in Ferrara, and Cintho, his pen name inspired by classical mythology. His role in court was quite important. He served as private secretary and court historian to Duke Ercole, and also sometimes served as a diplomat. He also held a chair in rhetoric at the University of Ferrara for much of his time there. As well as these roles, he was also writing plays. He was a dramatist as well as being a writer. He also was a theoretician about drama and about writing, and his theories about writing drama and poetry were quite influential in his time, not just in Italy, but across Europe. He worked in an era when reviving ancient Roman Greek plays was what people did, and before his time, comedies were really the popular thing at the Ferrara court. However, in this more serious age, Cintho was focusing on tragedies, and particularly drawing on again, examples from the ancient Roman past, particularly the tragedian Seneca. What Cintho did, which was new, was that he began to write his own original tragedies, drawing on the Roman and Greek models, and particularly Seneca. Seneca's plays are well known for their violence. His tragedies are quite violent. So just before we go further, Cintho wasn't the kind of writer who held anything back, and we'll be diving into murder, violence, suicide, and similar themes, quite heavy themes, as well as some other themes like racism and misogyny. So just to let your listeners know, it's really hard to discuss his work without really exploring that. So I want to give a particular example of his most popular and successful play, which is called Orbeke. He wrote a number, but this was the one that really set his reputation. It was performed around Italy and even before the King of France in Paris, and was reprinted in 10 editions, as well as drawing a lot of criticisms from traditionalists, which Cintho was quite able to respond to because of his academic standing and training. So Orbeke is on this Senecan model, but it's a Senecan play on steroids. Basically, Cintho took all the forms of violence that you find in different Senecan plays and put them into one play. And it was first performed in Cintho's own home in 1541 before an audience that included Duke Ercole II himself. This play was also influential in England. So if you know the Shakespeare play Titus Andronicus, it's very much the same kind of thing, lots of blood and guts on stage. Also, Gorboduc by Thomas Norton and Thomas Sackville, they are influenced by this kind of what is sometimes called the Senecan model, but really what was coming into England was what's better, as some scholars have put it, what's better framed as Italian Senecanism rather than ancient Roman Senecanism. And Cinzio was one of its most influential practitioners. So Orbeke is interesting for its stagecraft. So despite being an academic, Cinzio understood that if it wasn't theory, but audience reaction that would really determine if a play is a success. And he brought that consciousness to his practice. So he was particularly interested in horror. He saw horror as at the heart of tragedy. And in Orbeke, he foreshadows the horror to come in a prologue in which the chorus warns the audience that they really should leave because what they're about to see is too horrible. Please leave, the chorus says. And then the Furies come on stage swearing that they're going to destroy Orbeke, who's a princess, and Sulmona, her father, the king. And then, it's just kind of bloody violence from there. Sulmona finds out about her secret lover and husband. He has him killed together with his two children and puts their body parts on stage covered by veils. The children's bodies still have knives stuck in them. Orbeke, the princess, comes on stage with her maid, seemingly oblivious of what the audience knows, the horror that's just happened, and but that she doesn't. And it then proceeds as a revenge play. And in the end, Orbeke, after attaining her revenge, kills herself on stage. So very heavy Senecan play, also very influential. The plot of Titus and Andronicus, although different, has the same kind of horrific elements that we saw. So Cintho really brings horror to a new level. These kind of elements that I've been describing, they're still part of our popular culture today. And Cintho gives us an insight into how his audiences reacted. He writes about how, members of the audience were fainting, gasping, overcome by emotion. He even mentions a young foreign gentleman, a Mr. M.H., who was visibly distressed. And that gives us a concrete example of how the influence of Ferrara's court was spread through Europe. It was through the mutual visits of aristocrats through these courts who then travelled back to their own countries and brought these ideas, new things that could be tried in their own aristocratic circles. But where I got to know Cintho was as a writer, and his major work was a work called Li Hekatomithi, which is Greek and it means the 100 stories. It was published in 1565, so a bit later than the play we've just been discussing, and it contains 112 stories. And two of these stories provided plots from four Shakespeare plays, for Othello, and the other one was Measure for Measure. So basically the Hekatomithi, on the model of the Decameron or Canterbury Tales or 1001 Nights, there's a frame story and characters tell each other the Cinthio's 100 stories in that frame story. In Cinthio's version, the frame story starts in 1527 when Rome is sacked by an imperial army. And this was a real historical event. And then in the story, a group of men and women flee. They board a refugee ship for Marseille, and to pass the time, they tell each other stories. And these stories are organised in cycles of 10 with a frame narrative, and the characters in the frame story act as a kind of chorus. And as we're discussing today, it's Cinthio's source story for Othello that I've translated under the title Cinthio's Desdemona, the story that inspired Othello that we'll be focusing on. Perhaps that's a little, gives us a sense about Cinthio and his influence.
Absolutely. I've heard of Orbeke. I don't spend a lot of time reading theater pieces from the Renaissance. And if I'm reading about theater, it's typically the artists who do the ephemeral stage production works. Because one of the things to remember is that in these productions, some of the biggest names of art history
Yeah,
definitely created works for the stage. Um,
absolutely. Yeah.
this is I'm just thinking because of one of my all-time favorite authors is the Florentine Poliziano, who does his Orpheus, which of course, if we know the story of Orpheus, it ends in him getting ripped to shreds by these angry forest nymphs that he's upset by swearing off women after he loses his wife to Hades. And so he gets ripped to shreds. And it reminds me of multiple conversations I've had. I'm a huge horror film fan, and especially slasher films. And people can always ask about this. And even when I'm with people, because I travel around Italy a lot and we go to things like the Colosseum, and they say things like, this doesn't make sense to me that people would come and watch this kind of brutal activity. And I always say, we're still doing it. It's just not
Yeah.
real when we watch it. And now I'm thinking of Cintho, and I'm thinking of Poliziano, and I'm thinking of these plays. This is a revelation to me as we're speaking right now, as the sort of bridge between real horror and fantasy horror that has just captivated us for centuries. We just continue in one way or another. Anyway, I'm sorry. So Desdemona is one of the stories in this collection of stories by Cintho that you've translated here. Let's transition to Desdemona and the work that you've done on translating it, and introduce us to the story and anything else you'd like to speak about.
Perhaps starting with the title is the best way to introduce the story, why I chose to call it Cintho's Desdemona. The reason is that Desdemona is the only named character in the novella that Cintho tells. Everyone else in the novella is identified by their job title or background. So the character who is Iago is just called the ensign, who's the false flag in the story. Cassio is the captain. Othello is the Moor, and so on. And the choosing of the name by Cintho was very deliberate. And the story is very much focused on her and what happens to her, although, the plot is quite similar to Othello, and a lot of it is done by Othello and Cintho and Iago. The novella is only 5,000 words long, so although it provided the great bulk of the plot for Shakespeare's play, Othello, the play, is 26,000 words, so it's much longer. But the core of the story remains the same, despite, quite some significant differences. So the Desdemona story shows up in a cycle in Cintho's collection, a cycle of 10 stories about infidelity in marriage and its consequences. And in general, the Hekatomythi is focused on human frailties and vices, often leading to tragedy, and the respective merits and demerits of men and women. So, the male and female characters in the frame story, they're often at odds. They're often arguing with each other, with the women tending to advocate for the cause of women and criticising the misogyny of their society. And Cintho's Desdemona is pretty much about the themes of jealousy, violence, and manipulation, like in the Shakespeare play. The Iago character in the novella is really the opposite of Desdemona. So Desdemona kind of represents innocence, loyalty, and love, whereas Iago represents evil, manipulation, hatred, envy, betrayal. So, and Othello is Iago's dupe. Despite loving Desdemona deeply, he allows himself to be manipulated and deceived by Iago, and then succumbs to jealousy and hatred and murder in the end. So a key difference between Cintho and Shakespeare's version is that in Cintho, and this is really a profound difference, Iago hates Desdemona and wants to destroy her. Whereas in Shakespeare's play, Iago hates Othello and wants to destroy him. So Shakespeare really made it a story about jealousies and hatreds between men, whereas Cintho was telling us a story about the hatred of a man for a woman. And the reason Iago hates Desdemona is because she ignores him. So if we project that into our era, it's kind of Iago is a kind of incel in the Cintho version. So it's quite a profound difference. Much more about the issues of gender relations, and of course in the Shakespeare version about more masculine issues, and also about it's more greatly focused on issues of race.
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Renaissance people, if you are enjoying the Italian Renaissance podcast, I have good news. We're now active on Patreon. You can show your love for the show by becoming a patron and get access to additional resources, information, and artworks. Better yet, those who join the Renaissance Master or Renaissance Patron tier will get access to at least one additional podcast episode each month. My goal is to ensure that the main podcast remains a free, accessible source for everyone. Become a patron today through the link in the show notes to support the continued production of new episodes and help build and maintain this community. The Italian Renaissance shop is now also active on Etsy, linked in the show notes. Sport our logo or choose from a growing selection of Italian art-inspired designs. Discounts are offered to select Patreon tiers as well. Your support has my immortal gratitude. Now, enjoy the show. So let's talk about your book. It's the second in the series that is called Shakespeare Begins. Walk us through some of the details that link Cintho to Shakespeare. Feel free to go into some of those critical differences you mentioned in your book summary, especially these ideas about race and gender.
Sure, and I think those issues are among the important reasons why we should be aware of these stories and still explore them today. So with the Shakespeare Begins series, and hopefully by the time I'm finished, it will cover 5 Italian Renaissance novellas that inspired or contributed to Shakespeare plots. Romeo and Juliet by Matteo Bandello, as we've mentioned, Cinthio's Desdemona, also another of his Measure for Measure, and 2 other stories from Bandello, Twelfth Night and Much Ado About Nothing. So Cinzio gives us the plots for Othello and Measure for Measure. And both those stories are about the mistreatment of women. So Othello, of course, about the destruction and murder of Desdemona, and Measure for Measure about the sexual exploitation of a woman by a powerful male figure. So there's absolutely no question where Shakespeare got the plots for those 2 plays, even though we don't know of any English translations being available in his time. If you put the history plays aside, about half of Shakespeare's plays are set in Italy, which gives you a sense of the influence of Italy in England in this era. And Shakespeare wasn't at all unusual. It was just the kind of zeitgeist of the era. So we don't have direct evidence as to how Shakespeare had access to Cinthio's stories, but we do know, for example, that some of Cinthio's stories were being translated by English military officers in Ireland in the 1580s. Unfortunately, we don't have that for the Othello story. And Othello, of course, can't be described as fun, and it's one of Shakespeare's darkest tragedy, and Cinthio's version is almost horror. As we've seen, that's one of his themes. I ended up writing a lot of commentary about both Othello, the play, and Cinthio's Desdemona, because despite its difficult content, the narrative, the stories, they're important. For better or worse, these stories have shaped our culture, they've shaped understanding about racial difference and racism, about misogyny and honour. Othello is still, one of the best known Shakespeare plays, and it's been taught and being represented down the centuries. And of course, Desdemona's murder is today what we might call an honour killing. one of the surprising things is that they were thinking about these issues and not only writing about them in drama, in story, but also in more philosophical works, and also debating the way women were treated in their society. Women contributed to this debate as much as men. However, Cintho isn't always dark, and I thought it might be nice to read the beginning of Cinthio's Desdemona, just a short passage, a more happy passage, which is when we hear about Othello and Desdemona's marital bliss. And in my translation, I've introduced Othello's name to make it a little bit more accessible to the English-speaking audience.
So just to clarify, to help you link Cintho to Shakespeare, you're using Shakespeare's name retroactively to clarify in your translation how Cinthio's characters evolve into Shakespeare's characters.
Exactly. Yeah, that's right. So here goes. There was once in Venice Othello, a most valiant Moor, for his bold character and demonstrated wisdom and intrepid ingenuity in the arts of war. He was held in high esteem by the lords of the city, who in rewarding valiant deeds advanced their republic greatly. It happened that Desdemona, a virtuous lady of surpassing beauty, drawn not by womanly desire, but by Othello's virtue, fell in love with him, and he, won by the beauty and noble intellect of that lady, likewise fell in love with her. And their love was so favoured that they joined themselves in marriage, even though the lady's family did all they could so that she would take a husband other than he. And while they were in Venice, they lived together in happy concord and great tranquillity, so that there was never between them, I dare say, a less than loving word. It happened that the lords of Venice were rotating the forces under arms that they were accustomed to keep on the island of Cyprus, and they appointed the Moor as general of their battalions. Othello was overjoyed at the honour offered to him, for such a high office was rarely bestowed, and then only on men and nobles, strong and faithful, who had demonstrated in themselves the greatest valour. Nonetheless, his happiness was troubled whenever the distance and difficulties of the voyage presented themselves to his mind, thinking to himself that Desdemona would find it an unwelcome blow. That lady, who had only Othello in this world, was delighted at the recognition her husband had received for his virtues from so powerful and noble a republic. Accordingly, she was impatient for the moment when her husband and his company would set out on their mission, and she could accompany him to such an honoured post. Yet she could see that Othello was troubled, and this set her ill at ease. Not knowing the reason, one day as they dined together, she said to him, "Why are you so gloomy, Othello, after having been given such an honoured lordship by the Signoria?" To Desdemona, Othello replied, "My happiness at this honour is unsettled for the love I bear you, because I see that necessarily one of two consequences must follow. Either I will cast you with me into the perils of the deep, or so as not to expose you to such dangers, I will leave you here in Venice. The first would be unbearable to me, for every trouble that you bore and every danger you encountered would be to me terrible torture. The second, being compelled to leave you here, would be as odious to me, for to part from you would be to tear me from life itself." Desdemona, having heard this, said, "Oh, my husband, what are these thoughts that trouble your heart? Why do you let such things disturb you? I long to depart with you wherever you may go, whether I should have to pass through fire in nothing but a shift, or cross the seas with you in a secure and well-furnished ship. And even if there be troubles and dangers, I wish to face them with you, and I would hold myself little loved by you, if, to not have my company at sea, you thought to leave me here in Venice, or if you convinced yourself that you would rather have me here in safety than sharing together with you the same dangers. So it is my wish that you prepare for the journey with all that joy that befits the station that you hold." Then Othello, full of happiness, threw his arms about his wife and with an affectionate kiss said, "My dearest wife, may God long preserve our love." So, and of course, that's where the story takes a dark turn and Cintho introduces Iago.
That's a beautiful introduction. I mean, a beautiful translation as well. It's a difficult process to translate from early modern Italian and to refine it like that into English. So uh, I hope our audience is giving you a silent round of applause because that is quite a beautiful verse you've read for us.
Thank you. Thanks. Yeah, the literature is really kind of gets into your heart, and translation has that effect where you have to try and get really close to the author and their thoughts and feelings. So, that beautiful beginning doesn't really prepare us for what's going to come next. And I'll jump now to Shakespeare's version and to the end of the story, because I want to bring out what might be termed a philosophical racism that we see in Shakespeare's portrayal. So both before and after murdering his wife, Othello in the play is given heroic speeches. Before the murder, he's kind of trying to justify himself. And after the murder, we'll see what he says. So he seeks to excuse his gullibility and seems to blame his violence on his Moorish part. And what happens, in effect, or at least this is how I read it, is his Venetian part kills his Moorish part. So he's speaking to the officers, the officials, the military officers from Venice, and he says to them, "Set you down this, and say besides that in Aleppo once where a malignant and turbaned Turk beat a Venetian and traduced the state, I took by the throat the circumcised dog and smote him thus." And then Othello stabs himself. So, yeah, I don't see how you can read that other than reaching the conclusion that there's a philosophical idea that Othello's crimes are connected to his Moorish culture or his Moorish racial background. In Cinzio, there's no speeches like that. It's just a criminal, violent murder. And Othello and Iago, they're quite aware of its criminality and their instinct is to try to hide it. Cintho doesn't soften it as a murder, doesn't try to explain it. He just presents it in all its ugliness. And then the end of the story is Othello and Iago receiving their just resorts. So you see this kind of perhaps philosophical racism in the ideas that were in the mind of the playwright. But as far as race and racism goes, Othello is a complex text. It's been described by scholars as both racist and not racist. Even, the same scholar will say that. And what's undeniable is that there's a lot more racist content and speech in the play than the novella. As we've just seen in the beginning of the novella, we hear about how much Desdemona and Othello love each other. At the beginning of Shakespeare's play in Othello, right away, we're plunged in this fantastic drama. Just Shakespeare is amazing in how he dramatizes it. But straight away, we're plunged into Iago's jealousies and hatreds. We hear Brabantio, who's Desdemona's father, being tormented by Iago with racist speech about his daughter's liaison with Othello. And then it proceeds to a trial before the Duke, and Brabantio accusing Othello of witchcraft because there's no other way that this beautiful Venetian woman could have loved a black thing like Othello. So in the characters, we're hearing these kind of racist ideas. Very dramatic opening, which centers the racial context of Othello and Desdemona's union. I should also note, though, that Cinthio's version also has these racial elements, or not to the same extent, but Iago and Desdemona express some racist or racialized ideas. Iago uses it to torment Othello, for example. But that wasn't really central to what Cintho was about or trying to do with his novella. He was trying to tell a story about gender issues, about misogyny, about domestic violence.
So what I'm trying to figure out here is between Cinthio's version and between Shakespeare's version, the idea of the more itself, is it ever specified? Because I know even in modern Italian today, to speak about someone of a certain complexion, you still often hear people refer to them as a more. And I understand that that actually has layers of racial understanding. So what I mean is, do we get from Cintho and or Shakespeare specifically what kind of background Othello has? And are they different or the same?
It's hard. Yeah, it's one of the questions that comes up and is also discussed in the literature. And there isn't really a way of resolving exactly what they meant. You know, they both writers use the term black, both writers use the term more. As in Italy, it refers to, or generally the idea refers to someone of North African background and has cultural as well and religious otherness as well as racial otherness. But how exactly Cintho meant it, how exactly Shakespeare meant it, we don't really know. But it could be someone of sub-Saharan background, it could be someone more of North African background. I might explore a little bit more how these issues play out in the play and the story. So in the character, if we consider the character of Iago, it's pretty clear he's not meant to be liked in either version. And even though he's such a central character, and he's given a lot of airtime in the play, a lot of space in the novella. And in Shakespeare's version, he's either racist himself or he uses racism to pursue his goal of destroying Othello. And it's perhaps the earliest pen portrait of a racist. It's powerful and it's ugly, and it's clearly meant to be repulsive. And this is one of the complexities of the Othello story. So although we're seeing characters expressing these racist ideas, the playwright is also showing us a very ugly portrait of racism as we would understand it today. Of course, the term racism wasn't even invented until centuries later. So both the novella and its frame story and the play have these embedded ideas about racism, also gender relations. And I'll talk a little bit perhaps about that as well. We've already mentioned, so Cintho's Desdemona appears in a cycle of stories about infidelity of marriage. There's 10 stories about that theme in Cintho's collection. And the women, at the end of that cycle, the women in Cintho's frame story complain about the injustice of how men treat women. So to give you a flavour of that, this is a woman advocating for the women in the story. She says, "It would be better if you men refrained from soliciting and tempting women to ill, for if you did not in your lustfulness trouble them, little would you see of what you term infidelity. But you have wanted to make everything permissible to you, and have put yourselves beyond the law, which is no less made for us than for you, for the same sin ought to have the same penalty." So she's pointing out male hypocrisy and the injustice of the society and laws of the time and practices of the time that would often visit death on a woman for infidelity, but would overlook or even praise, the dalliances of men. These kind of ideas we also see in Shakespeare. In the play, Emilia expresses some ideas like this in a conversation with Desdemona, and they're also part of a broader philosophical conversation going on in literature, in Renaissance literature and Elizabethan literature and philosophy about the relationship between genders. So it's a kind of really interesting aspect of this era, that they were really thinking about these issues and struggling with some of the uglier sides of their social realities. what they were doing, with these conversations that we're seeing in this play and in this story about gender relations, about race, these are conversations, these are issues that are still with us today. I think through studying the stories, we can better understand how we've got to where we are, why these issues are so important, and perhaps can help us better deal with them today as well. Shortly after, in 1600, England was passing laws to expel its Moorish and black population. So that gives us an idea that there were enough people of darker hue that you see kind of another issue that's still with us today, the politics of immigration. And, as we've mentioned, Othello is a fictional character, but in England and in the Italian peninsula, there were both black and North African people who were living as part of these communities. We already mentioned Alessandro de' Medici. And, as one scholar mentions, we know the story of a fictional character, but we don't know Othello, but we don't know the story of these real black Tudors. And, of course, there were slaves in both Italy and England, but also these people were in a diversity of walks of life. They were part of their societies and times. There's an excellent documentary. There's not a lot of scholarship that's being done about the black presence and about issues of race in the Italian Renaissance, but there's an excellent documentary called The Black Italian Renaissance, made in 2022, and it looks at the black presence in Renaissance visual arts and sculpture and shows how extensive that presence was. And it shows us through the visual arts how what were earlier matter-of-fact representations of people, in all sorts of works of life, perhaps an ambassador or a soldier or a member of a community. These kind of representations begin to change, and the representations begin to represent ideas of racial hierarchy. So there's a painting of Isabella d'Este with her hand on the shoulder of a black boy, undoubtedly her slave.
I was going to say there's this a whole history of portrait paintings of the noble person with their servant or slave, and sometimes black and sometimes not. I always like to remind people this is pre-Atlantic slave trade. Yeah, there's racialized slavery, but it's not exclusively racialized slavery. But sometimes it's religious based. Like you may enslave people who are non-Christians. On the Islamic side of the Mediterranean, you may enslave people who are non-Muslims. And it was less to do with your skin tone, even though that had a huge factor in determining whether or not someone was able to be enslaved.
Yeah. So, and that's absolutely right. And Venice and Genoa, they were both big players in the slave trade in the Mediterranean, as the Muslim shore also was. So the Mediterranean context is a little bit different in that sense, but it's also the era when the Atlantic slave trade is taking off, and that begins to have an influence in Italy as slaves from that trade also start to be imported into Italy much later in the piece. And of course we're also now in the era of colonialism, where the Spanish and Portuguese have destroyed an entire multiple civilizations in the Americas. Right. As these things were happening, the European racial consciousness is crystallizing and solidifying, and then we get these horrible centuries where racism comes to a peak in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, in the horrible ways that we know. But at the time of Shakespeare and the time of Cintho, that horrible history hadn't happened. When they're and I think that it's important to bear that context in mind.
So just wanted to wrap up here and give you the floor to any final remarks or loose ends or concepts that you wanted to shore up before we say goodbye to our listeners.
Thanks, Lawrence. It's been a wonderful conversation, and one of the delights of working on this project, Shakespeare Begins, is really discovering these amazing stories that have traveled across culture, through time, across geographies. And the reason Shakespeare based his plays on these Italian Renaissance novellas is that they're great stories and they still affect us in one way or another. Some of them are just delightful or moving. Some are profoundly thought-provoking, like the story we've been discussing today. And if your listeners are interested in getting a copy of Cinthio's Desdemona, the story that inspired Othello, a Google or Amazon search should bring it up. It's available in both a bilingual and an English-only edition from Amazon and other online vendors. Lawrence, I want to thank you again for this opportunity to present this work and share it with your listeners. And thank you again. It's been a wonderful conversation. Congratulations on your podcast.
Thank you so much, Michael. I'm really, really thankful that you came on and we were able to link this exciting work to enormous concepts in the history of literature and court of Ferrara and ultimately Shakespeare. So thank you so much, Michael.
Thank you, Lawrence.
My dear listeners, thank you for tuning in and thank you for giving the floor to Michael Curtotti today. Moving forward, we're going to look into the court of Mantua and the happenings with Isabella d'Este. So we're continuing our conversation of the d'Este, but she joins the Gonzaga court in Mantua. Until next time, my dear listeners, arrivederci.